Hey, Amanda. Hi,
Hi.
everybody. Hi, sorry for the delay.
It's okay. Tea is worth it when you just got off a plane. So thank you, Yossi, so much for joining us just off a plane from Israel for your book tour.
Truly a pleasure.
We are so lucky to have you here and to join us for this conversation. And I mean, you know this, we've talked about this. Everyone who reads your book is so moved by it, so empowered by it. You're giving people language, you're helping people understand
Thank
so
you.
many complicated topics. It's so true. I don't hand out compliments so quickly, but I really feel so privileged to launch the virtual Zioness book club with you. The stories that we read shape the way that we understand the environments in which we live and engage, and the book club is going to help us do a better job connecting to each other and the world, and I know that's the work that you do every day, Yossi. So it's just a privilege to introduce you. I think everybody knows this, but Yossi is an award-winning author, and his book is a New York Times bestseller. It's reaching people all over the world. It's been downloaded 1,000 times, the Arabic version already, and the social media campaign on that is just beginning. And Yossi works every day to humanize people who don't understand each other and to help people find ways to engage on this very complicated topic of the conflict. And I just want to thank you again and say, please take it away.
Well, Amanda, thank you, and hi, everybody. I really just want to say, first of all, how much I respect and appreciate your work, Amanda. You're really one of the heroes at this moment, and all of you in Zionists who are fighting the good fight. This is really the I would say, the most important struggle of this generation for the people is to defend the integrity of our story. For me, the definition of the Jewish people is that we're a story that we tell ourselves. That's what the Jews. That's who the Jews are. That's why our religious epic, our founding religious document is not just a book of laws, but it's a book of stories. That's why the most important ritual that connects Jews, even remote Jews from Judaism, is the Seder, because that's the moment when we all come together once a year to retell the story of our origins. But we're a story, and our story is being systematically assaulted in our time, and Zioness is, to my mind, one of the most important pushbacks we've seen within American Jewry. So I'm not just delighted to be here. I'm really honored to be here.
Thank you.
So let's launch the book club.
Yes.
So for those of you who excuse me, for those of you who may not be familiar with the book, it is a series of 10 letters addressed to an imaginary Palestinian neighbor across the valley from where I live at the edge of Jerusalem. And our two hills are separated by the security barrier, which in Jerusalem is a concrete wall. And the book is an attempt to explain who the Jews are, why we're here, there, why I'm their neighbor, why we came back home, why we consider the land that we share with the Palestinians to be home. And the book, in a sense, is a continuation of a previous book that I published in 2001, called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, which tells of a journey that I took, a year-long journey, into Palestinian society in 1999-2000, just before the Second Intifada broke out, and made a journey like that inconceivable today. that was a journey of empathy. It was an attempt to listen to the stories of my neighbors. It was an attempt to see whether religious people from different faiths could actually experience something of God's presence together in that land. And I went into mosques and monasteries and tried to experience where where I was cut off. But basically, the Israeli political map was fundamentally transformed in the year 2000. And whatever one's narrative of the year 2000 may be, most Israelis deeply believe that the Israeli government at that time tried to make peace, tried to reach a two-state solution, and the Palestinian leadership of that time not only rejected it, but launched a 4-year war of suicide bombing. And so the credibility of the peace camp was effectively destroyed in the year 2000. And so my response to the publishers who were saying, we'll publish the book if you find a partner, is, well, that might have reflected my own personal reality and the reality of at least part of Israeli and Palestinian society 20 years ago. It no longer did, and it felt artificial. The second, and I would say in some ways more profound reason why I felt I needed to write the book in this way, which is not to be written as a dialogue or a debate with a Palestinian, but to put out my narrative in a book that is short and hopefully accessible, is because, as we all know, the Israeli narrative is not only under attack, but in large part of the progressive world is actually being erased. And so I felt the need initially to put out a book that explains who we are, what our story is, and then invite Palestinians to respond. And what I said to the publishers was, I envision a second state, that there will be, hopefully there will be Palestinian responses, and whatever those responses are, I'll then go public, and we can then model a conversation over narratives. And so that's where we are now. The book is coming out next month in a new edition, a paperback, which will have an extensive new epilogue of letters from Palestinians with Israeli neighbors. And I chose about a dozen of the best letters, most thoughtful letters that I received from Palestinians. And I'm publishing it as the final word in the book. That was a decision that was very clear to me from the beginning. If I do get substantive responses, that I would give them the last word in the next edition of the book. And it's interesting because there's something deeply countercultural about this political moment in giving your adversary the last word in your own book. And these days, we're not supposed to be discussing politics with our adversaries, having effectively gladiatorial combat. And so I'm hoping that the book will not only model what a respectful disagreement over narratives might look like between Israelis and Palestinians, and there are deep disagreements certainly in the narrative that I present and the responses like Palestinians, but more broadly that this could be a model for all kinds of other conversations, and the kinds of conversations that need to be happening in Israel, in America, and elsewhere. So the book was criticized to some extent, understandably. Excuse me. The book was criticized primarily on the grounds that here I am, part of the occupying power, expecting my occupying Palestinian neighbor to listen respectfully to my innocent. And by what right do I, as an occupier, have, given the extreme asymmetry in power between Israelis and Palestinians, to listen, to pay attention to my story? And my responses are really severalfold. One is that we Israelis are a strange occupier, in the sense that we are the only occupier that I know of that fears that if we withdraw from territory, it will not only diminish us, which is true of any territorial. The critics of the book, to some extent justifiably, pushed back and said, how can you, as part of an occupying country, expect the occupied people to listen to your narrative? And my response was that Israelis are a very strange occupier, in the sense that many Israelis believe that a withdrawal from the West Bank could endanger the country to the point where we might not be able to defend ourselves adequately in one of the most dangerous and unstable countries. And so to end the occupation will require addressing Israeli fears. And those fears, which are fears that I share, and I think most Israelis share, is that if we were to withdraw from the West Bank, Hamas might build a void. And that the Palestinian national movement, in all of its factions, has not yet come to terms with the indigenousness of the Jewish people, with our right to national sovereignty, part of the land that we share with the Palestinians. And so those fears, for very practical reasons, those fears need to be addressed, because Israelis, for better or for worse, we hold the key to Palestine. And no amount of external pressure is going to force Israelis into withdrawing from the West Bank if we feel that that would be suicide. And so what Israelis need, what I need, and this is one of the reasons I wrote this book, I need to hear from Palestinians the words that you belong to this land, and we accept the fact that there are two indigenous peoples who need to share this land. Not because we want to, we wish you weren't here, I get that. Most Israelis would say the same thing. But we're both there, and we need to respect each other. So I wrote the book to explain to Palestinians who never hear the story of who we are and how we see ourselves, and what our 4,000-year connection to this land is. You know, we're so good as a people explaining ourselves to various constituencies, members of Congress, to media, and no Israeli writer has ever turned toward it. But listen, let me tell you how we see ourselves, not to convince you, not to tell you that my narrative is right and your narrative is wrong. Neither of us is going to be convinced by the narrative. But just as neither people is going away, neither narrative is going away. So let's start getting used to hearing each other's stories. And what I tried to do in the book is write our narrative from a very personal. And those are the kinds of stories we need to start hearing from. The last point here about why I feel that the argument of the asymmetry of power doesn't apply to or doesn't negate this effort is because most Israelis view this conflict in a way that outsiders don't understand. When outsiders look at the conflict, it's Israel versus the Palestinians. Israelis have a kind of a split screen in our heads, where one side of the screen is Israel versus the Palestinians, and on that side of the screen, we are Goliath and the Palestinians. On the other side of the screen, It's Israel in the Arab and Muslim world, and then the power dynamics begin. And so this notion of radical asymmetry, which is certainly how Palestinians experience the conflict, is not necessarily how Israelis. And so for all those reasons, I felt the need to start a conversation with any of my neighbors who are interested in picking up on this about irreconcilable narratives, because our narratives are never going to meet. I recently heard from one of the former Palestinian negotiators at Camp David in the year 2000. We did an event together, and afterwards he said to me, someone had the bright idea at Camp David of trying to get the Israeli and Palestinian negotiators to come up with a joint narrative of the conflict. And he said it almost destroyed peace talks, or other things destroyed peace talks. But it's not going to happen that way. We're not going to come up with a neat package where both sides are going to agree. But we do, I believe, need to create a dynamic in which there's a conversation rather than a take no prisoners debate, which is how this has been discussed in the last 17 months. The book can be a little bit perplexing for some readers, excuse me, who are expecting a left-wing perspective. The book is not written from a left-wing political point of view. It's written very much from the camp of the Israeli Senate. And if you look at the shift in the Israeli political map, this last election was really the I think most interesting moment in Israel politically, because it showed definitively that the debate in Israel is no longer between right and left, but right and center. This is something that many American Jews have not yet internalized. Because for American Jewry, the dividing line is still left versus right. And when I come to the States to lecture to communities, I often feel that I'm in a time warp. And the center and the voice of the center hasn't yet penetrated the American Jewish conversation on the conflict. And so the center, the perspective that really animates this book, and the reason why I think it's useful in the sense that if Palestinians continue speaking to the Israeli left, there will never be peace, because the Israeli left can no longer has the credibility or even the moral authority to lead a majority of Israelis for all kinds of reasons, but especially because of the year 2000 and the collapse of the credibility of the people in the sector. And so, for better or for worse, and I try to make this point in the book, my Palestinian neighbors are going to have to deal like me, rather than with people who it might be easier for them to deal with in Israel, but who really represent almost no one anymore. The only place where the Israeli left still has tremendous vitality is in the American Jewish community. And that's part of the imbalance in our relationship today, is that a majority of American Jews are engaging, those who engage with Israel, tend to engage with that part of Israel that most Israeli Jews have no relationship with. For example, Breaking the Silence is an organization that you never hear about in Israel. For all practical purposes, they do not exist in the Israeli conversation. When I come to the American Jewish community, and suddenly everybody's talking. But that's an example of the imbalance in the relationship today. The center basically is that large part of the Israeli political map that has internalized the left-right debate. So that the left-right argument isn't just happening out there between two rival camps, happening inside of me. happening inside of each of these who are infected. And centrists basically believe that the left is correct, that the occupation is untenable, is a disaster for Israel, and the right is correct that the Palestinian national movement has not yet made its peace with our legitimacy, our existence, and therefore the chances of coming to an agreement with the Palestinian national movement are remote, if non-existent. And a centrist Israeli essentially has nightmares about a Palestinian state. One is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and the centrist. If you pushed me into a corner, say, okay, which of those nightmares scares you more? My response is, I am more frightened by the absence of a Palestinian state, the continuation of status quo for another 50 years than I am of the creation of the Palestinian state. But I would quickly add, just barely. And I think that that's really important for American Jews to understand, that even Israelis like me who desperately want a two-state solution are also desperately afraid of it, and that the argument is not simple. And so when you support a two-state solution, you need to understand just how frightening that prospect is for Israelis in 2019, when we look around our borders and we see allies, Iran or Iranian revolutionary forces. In Syria, we see a kind of encirclement of Israel or Iranian forces. And it never ceases to astonish me how so much of the international community and part of the American Jewish community discuss the Palestinian issue and the creation of a Palestinian state in a void, as if Israel were not sitting on a volcano, really in one of the most dangerous. So what do we do in the meantime, in the absence of a centrist? Ones would be several. One is, first of all, don't foreclose our option for a long term, which means stop building all over the map. And secondly, to actively pursue any openings, however slender, with the Palestinians and with the region in general. And so that, I think, is really a way of understanding the perspective from which I wrote. I'll go on for another 15 minutes and then we'll open for conversation.
Perfect.
Okay. One of my goals in the book was, you mentioned, Amanda, about giving Jews language for the conflict. And one of my goals here was to try to help create a 21st century language with which to discuss Israel and Zionism, because much of the American Jewish community is still speaking a 20th century. And by that I mean several things. First of all, this notion, and this is certainly true on the American Jewish right, and to some extent on the Israeli right as well, although I find it funnily enough strong here, this notion that there's no such thing as Palestinian people, that expressing empathy with the Palestinians is an act of betrayal of Israel. And so the first point in a 21st century narrative of Israel is to frankly come to terms with the battering of the Palestinians. Now, why that happened, who's responsible, that's another argument. But the starting point is that my return, which I celebrate unequivocally as one of the greatest moments in Jewish history, had the effect of shattering the Palestinian. Now, one can argue, again, and who is responsible. I have my own thoughts on the issue, which are more centrist than left-wing. And nevertheless, that is the beginning of a 21st century conversation on the Palestinians. The second conversation that I tried to model in the book is how to combine empathy for the Palestinians while maintaining the dignity of our narrative, without excessive apology, without excessive guilt, laying out who we are, what our story is, and maintaining the dignity of our nation. The next element of a 21st century narrative on Israel is to go beyond the Eurocentric understanding of Israel's. The normative American Jewish arc in speaking about the creation of Israel is Zionism begins with the pogroms or the Dreyfus trial, and it culminates in the Holocaust. The problem with that narrative is that it erases at least half the Jews of Israel, who come from families that left one part of the Middle East and came to another part of the Middle East and did not experience the Holocaust. The other problem with a Eurocentric and Holocaust-driven narrative is that it opens the way to the accusation of Israel as a colonialist intrusion into the Arab world, and the argument that, well, okay, we're sorry that this happened to you, but why should the Palestinians pay the price for it? The Holocaust is not the reason why Israel exists. I think that really needs to be effective. The final reason why I deeply resent this Eurocentric notion of Israel's existence is because my understanding of Zionism is that it is the meeting point of need and longing. Need was the urgent existential need of first the Jews in Europe and then the Jews in the Middle East to find them. And second, and no less important, Zionism was the fulfillment of 2,000 years of longing to the land. And the extraordinary achievements of the Jewish people we have virtually erased when we displace the Zionism of longing and only speak of Israel in terms of Semitism refuge, is that the Jewish people for 2,000 years managed to maintain a kind of vicarious indigenousness with the land that we lost but never forgot. And then when the time came and we managed the unbelievable accomplishment of actually returning, that was the expression of the first great achievement, which was to maintain that passion and connection with the land that we had lost. So that's a story that we need to start telling again. It's the next point that I want to speak about in a way will just contradict what I said a moment ago, which is I do want to now speak about antisemitism. And one reason for that is that I'm speaking to you all from a hotel room in Pittsburgh. I just got into Pittsburgh this afternoon, and my friend who picked me up, Rabbi Jamie Gibson, who's the sponsor here, said, "Do you want to go to the synagogue?" And of course, before I checked the hotel, we drove straight to the Tree of Life. And so Pittsburgh now has a very definite place on the Jewish map. And Pittsburgh is a place where the worst Jewish massacre in America. And so I feel the need to, despite what I said a moment ago, to now turn to the issue of antisemitism. My definition of anti-Semitism is that it turns the Jew into the symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as its most respectable or detestable qualities. So under Christianity, the Jew was the Christ killer. Under communism, the Jew was the capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was the race polluter. And now in the era of human rights, where the most detestable quality is racism, the Jewish state becomes the world symbol for racism. The Jewish state, this is something that is so obvious, but it just really hit me strongly the other day as I was preparing the talk. That is that the Jewish state is the most hated country in the world by far. Now, I think that we need to pause for a moment to let that sink in, because that says something very clear about what this moment is and about what the nature of the Antichrist soul on the is. It has turned us into the world's symbol again of what this civilization defines as its worst moment. Now, you all know the argument that Jews are having in this country, which is the greater threat, anti-Semitism from the left, anti-Semitism from the right. It depends what country you're sitting in when you ask them. If you ask that question sitting in Pittsburgh, the answer is certainly the greater lethal threat is from the far right. If, God forbid, there's another synagogue shooting, it most likely will come in this country from the white supremacists. Sitting in France or England, the answers are very different. The anti-Semitic violence in France, primarily from Islamists. The anti-Semitism in England is coming primarily from the far left. Some of you may know of a poll that was taken not long ago, Jews in England. Would you consider leaving, emigrating if Corbyn became prime minister? 40% affirmatively. I recently, with a group of young Jews from England, were visiting Jerusalem, 25 young people, and I said, how many of you would consider leaving if Corbyn became prime minister?
You're breaking up,
So,
Yossi.
I'm breaking up.
Yeah, I think it's just the speaker. I don't know. You're still on the live. Everything's good, but
Okay.
there's a little bit of I think if the speaker goes under your chin.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think that when we ask the question which threat is greater, it's not a zero-sum game, unfortunately. We are living at a moment where we are being assaulted from multiple directions. And those progressive Jews who want to focus only on anti-Semitism that's coming from white supremacists, because that makes their alliances with their camp more comfortable, are in effect asking American Jews to remove themselves from the world Jewish situation and only focus on the threat that American Jews are facing. Again, today is primarily, though not exclusively, all right? And that seems to me a solipsistic approach to the threats that the Jewish people are facing. I was here in the U.S. when the Pittsburgh massacre happened, and I spent the weeks afterwards traveling the American Jewish community and participating in memorial services. And what I noticed was that American Jews were essentially telling themselves two stories about it. The first was an American story, the second was the Jews. The American story placed Pittsburgh geographically in a very particular trajectory of Charlottesville, Thousand Oaks, Las Vegas, all the places where there had been Charlotte, all the places where there had been either random violence or attacks against churches or mosques. And in the American story, Pittsburgh was just the latest in a series of either random and mindless violence or hate-driven violence, but not specifically Jewish. second story that American Jews were telling about Pittsburgh was very much a Jewish story. And there the geography was Buenos Aires, Toulouse, Paris, Jerusalem. And I think that both of those stories need to be told by American Jews because both of those stories are true. One of the things that really struck me walking around today in Pittsburgh was seeing, in the hotel that I'm staying in, at the entrance to the hotel, there's a big sign with a Jewish star saying no to hate. And that's part of the American story. The way that your non-Jewish neighbors responded to Pittsburgh was in effect a negation of the story that, now American Jews are part of the worldwide assault against Jews, because America still is different. On the other hand, it was part, that's the paradox, it was part of a worldwide assault, and what has happened to Jews in other parts of the world has now come to America. And so for American Jews to be faithful to this moment, you need to tell those two stories. What is under assault today is the great post-Holocaust Jewish achievement, which was the reclamation of power. And in Israel, we reclaimed hard power, military power. And in America, you reclaimed soft power, the power of persuasion, the power of a lobby, the power of philanthropy, of building alliances. And both of those forms of power are now being assaulted. The legitimacy of the post-war Jewish reclamation of power is under assault. And so that's what we are trying to do. And I think that maybe I'll say one last comment. That is about the increasingly strained relationship between American Jewish liberals and Israel. And to some extent, I understand the reasons for the alienation. But the more that I hear American Jews turning away from Israel, the more I realize now why I actually moved to Israel 36 years ago, 7 years ago, 1982. I don't know, figure it out. And the reason for that, and I used to have all kinds of reasons for people. The reason that I now understand why I went is to deny myself the privilege, the right, the ability to turn away from Israel. I wanted to join with those Jews who have nowhere else to go. And they are stuck in the Israeli story. I wanted to be with the Ethiopians and the Russians and the Moroccans, and that was the part of the Jewish people that I wanted to be with. People, those who have no choice because that. And so I would frame it in a very provocative way. I'm going to use deliberately provocative language. It is that I made Aliyah, I moved to Israel, to deny myself the American Jewish privilege of turning away from it. I did not want to be part of I didn't want that option. And so what I so much appreciate about all of you in Zionists is that you've made a similar choice, that you can't turn away, as messy as this relationship is, as messy as Israel is, and unfortunately, it's going to get a lot messier with this new government. Yeah. You guys are our partners. You're in this fight, and thank you. So let's open for a conversation.
Thank you. You left me with so much, and I have a couple of my own questions. I'm going to start with where you just ended and say, you illustrated the need for Zionists so beautifully there, because most American Jews, I think according to Mark Mellman's polls, 92% of American Jews identify as Zionists. And we haven't had a community for all of those people because 75% of American Jews identify as members of the political left here. But there hasn't been a place where you can be a committed Zionist without qualifying your Zionism or bashing Israeli policy to say, I'm a Zionist, I believe Israel should exist, but I hate the government and I think settlements are the obstacle to peace and I think that all of these things are inhumane. We may believe them. I believe a lot of them, but it doesn't in any way change my commitment to the Zionist dream and its manifestation in the contemporary state. And I think that now that the Zionist community exists and we see how powerful it is and how much it's resonating with so many people, I really feel like we can recapture all of those people that have been feeling lost and homeless and have been choosing when faced with a false choice between their domestic, left of center, progressive, liberal ideals and their commitment to Zionism, that they no longer have to make a choice. And once that community exists, I really believe that there will be so much more strength in our Jewish American community, so much more support for Israel, despite the challenges that you said, that you mentioned, that we all know it will get even more messy with this government. But we don't have to like the government to believe the state should exist. And I think nobody watching right now likes the government of America, but none of us question whether America should continue to exist.
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting, which is the way that it's currently phrased is, well, I support Israel, I support its right to exist, but I oppose such and such. I think we need to change the but to an and. I support Israel, I love Israel, and I oppose these policies because I love Israel, because I support Israel, and I want to see a better Israel. It's not a but. I oppose certain policies precisely because Israel means so much to me, and I want a better Israel. So let's just switch the but to an and.
Okay, I support that. So my first question, I'm going to tie in with two questions that are on the Facebook stream and also your personal work. You talked about, what was it that brought me? Oh, which is worse, the anti-Semitism on the left and the right. And this is unfortunately a debate that everybody feels like needs to happen. I don't feel like it needs to happen. I feel like pointing at the other side is just refusing to take responsibility for what exists in our spaces, which we can fight. I don't have any ability to fight anti-Semitism on the right because people on the right know that they're not accountable to me. I'm not going to vote for them anyway. So I really feel like we need to fight what's in our spaces and not focus so much, on what's somewhere else. We need to all work to push it out from any space, any community where we are a member and where it exists. Having said that, this is a conversation that happens all the time, and I want to make sure that everybody has the language. We talked at the beginning about the language that they need to talk about white nationalism, to talk about anti-Semitism on the left, and to talk about anti-Semitism from the Islamist world. And there was recently an article by Fareed Zakaria, and I know my friend who's watching right now read it and has talked a lot about it, about anti-Semitism in the sort of current, the contemporary Muslim world, but how that is a shift, that historically Jews in the Muslim world were safer than in the Christian world, in Christian society, where white nationalism is so prevalent. And Fareed, for example, in his article talks about how we know 850,000 Jews became refugees in the 40s and 50s from the Middle East and North Africa. But nobody's asking the question of what they were doing there in the first place. Obviously, they were safe there before that, since they were there the whole time. So that's one part of the question. What is the story with that? I know, we've talked about this already, and you've mentioned it's more complicated than that. So I'm curious your thoughts. Someone in the Facebook stream wrote, I see many Jewish pro-peace organizations, both in the US and in Israel. Do you see pro-peace movements among Arabs in Israel and the West Bank? So tying these things together, I guess the theme of the question is the relationship between Jewish and Muslim communities, Israeli and Palestinian communities, in the context of a conversation for peace. And so I will ask you to start the answer to your question by talking about your work at the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Muslim Leadership Initiative. Wow. Low-key question.
Yeah. So I co-direct a program called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, MLI, which is sponsored by the Hartman Institute. And my co-director is Imam Abdullah Tepli, who heads Muslim Affairs at Duke University. And Abdullah was actually the initiator. He came to Hartman and asked us to house a program that would bring young emerging Muslim American leaders to Jerusalem, to Hartman, not just an Israeli institution, but an avowedly famous institution, to do an educational program about Jewish identity, the meaning of, or the intersection, to use the loaded word, between religion, peoplehood, land, national sovereignty. And Abdullah said, look, we Muslims have no problem with the Jews as a religion, but we don't understand peoplehood and land and sovereignty. So we need to unpack that. But we've been doing this program for the last 7 years. We're about to welcome our 7th cohort to Jerusalem. And it's an extraordinary program. We have over 100 graduates. Some of them are really front-rank people, emerging Muslim American. The program is very controversial. There are lots of people in the Muslim who hate this program, breaking the boycott. And it's at least the boycott of Israeli. And the program has earned the credibility of participants to the extent where we now have cohorts that are largely populated by people who are recommended from graduates, by graduates. And so the program really has maintained overwhelming support on the part of it. And it's a very tough audience. Our participants are strongly pro-Palestinian, strongly critical of Israel. This is not a Hasbara program. It's not a program aimed at convincing Muslim American leaders about Israeli positions. It's an educational program that invites Muslim leaders into an internal about who we are. To answer your question about Jews in the Muslim world, there are two versions, two narratives that you'll hear, and both of them are woefully simplistic. The first is the narrative that the Jews under Islam were mistreated, were treated as second or third or fourth class, were humiliated, and that the expulsion or the flight of Jews from Muslim countries in the late 40s and 50s of this centuries-old process of humiliation. The second, equally simplistic narrative is, we were great to you Jews. You had it wonderful under Islam. And the truth of it is, sometimes in different countries at different periods, Jews were humiliated or physically threatened or something. And in other places, at other times, Jews were welcomed. Jews regarded themselves as, to some extent, were bad.
Okay, so you were saying there are two narratives in the Muslim world, and they are too simplistic.
Well, there's the anti-Muslim narrative that you'll find, let's say, on the Jewish right, that it was one long process of humiliation, and Islam is anti-Jewish. And then you'll have the Muslim apologist narrative, which is, we were great to you. And what was the problem? You can live happily ever after under the benevolent control of Islam. And so my response is, thank you. There weren't gas chambers. Grateful for that, but that's really setting the bar quite low. And yes, Jews in Morocco tend to have warmer memories countries than Jews from Iraq, certainly Jews from Yemen. Tunisia seems to have been better than Algeria. The circumstances change, place and time. The last question was, are there peace movements in the Arab world among Palestinians? There are voices within the Palestinian people who certainly are ready for the kind of conversation that I've tried to initiate in the book. And the next version of the book, the paperback, will showcase those voices. And I think they're significant. They're thoughtful, they're smart, they're willing to engage on the premise that they challenge me very strongly on all narrative points in this book, and that's fine. That's what I was hoping for. I have one guy who wrote me a letter that's in the book, grew up in a refugee camp in Beirut, now lives in Australia where he's a BDS activist. And he wrote me a letter saying, I read your book 3 times. Here's what I liked and learned. Here's what I hated. Here's where you were a propagandist. And it's great. We've become friends.
Wow.
We correspond. With most of the people who appear in the book, that's the pattern. You know, I would get a very angry letter, not always, but often, starting off with an angry letter, but there was something in the tone that I felt I could engage with. And so we began a correspondence. And with, I would say most of them, I personal. And so that's, in a way, that's the response retroactively to all those New York editors that go find a Palestinian partner. And I felt I needed to go through this process. It couldn't be pretend. And I needed to write a book and say, listen, this is where I am. And the book opens with, dear neighbor. I call you neighbor because I don't know your name. I look out on your hill. I see the lights of your homes. I hear the muezzin at 4 in the morning when I have insomnia. And yet, I don't know anything about you. That's our reality in 2019. But as a result of this book, I've now begun relationships in Palestinian society that I didn't think I would ever have, that most Israeli Jews don't really have access to.
Right.
So this book has really given me something of that back. The last thing that I'd like to say is that we need to start paying closer attention to the changes in the Arab world. Now, this is very controversial for understandable reasons among many Americans, because those changes are happening in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in the Gulf states, countries that many Americans understandably regard as not positive forces. From an Israeli perspective, and this is really where I would say most Israelis, probably most liberal American Jews, differ. From an Israeli perspective, we look at Assad, we look at Iraq, and our response is Saudi Arabia. We can make a deal with Saudi Arabia. We can make a deal with Sisi. They're willing to be part of a new realignment in the Middle East. I don't know of any Israeli Jew that would not welcome the visit of the Saudi crown prince to Jerusalem if he were to come.
Wow.
And that would be very controversial among many Americans. From where I'm sitting, that's not a question.
Because he's sort of open to Israel's existence.
Because he's the custodian of Mecca. And if the custodian of Mecca is willing to engage with the state of Israel, that is a historic opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't afford to have the kinds of purist politics that perhaps Jews who don't live in the Middle East, can allow themselves to have. That's part of the disconnect. And we're going to have to learn to live with the fact that American Jews and Israelis live in really different realities. And as a result of that, have very different ways of navigating politics.
Right. Fascinating. All right, so speaking about politics, someone wrote in the comments before we broke up the last recording, asking whether you think that BDS is moving the Israeli populace to the right. And I know you have thoughts on this, so I'm interested in them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that I wouldn't give BDS specifically too much power or credit. Israelis are aware of BDS, increasingly so, but I think that it's the general mood of antipathy to Israel. The fact that the UN will vote to condemn Israel more than all other countries. The general animus toward Israel, and BDS, of course, is a part of that. If you look at the pattern of Israeli response to the international mood toward Israel, you'll find that when Israelis feel that they are unfairly stigmatized, demonized, they turn rightward. When they feel that there's a willingness in the international community to hear an Israeli version of events, it tends to play out in the more moderate politics. Mm-hmm. And I write about that in the book. I raise several examples that I think really are significant in understanding the Israeli mindset. It doesn't work to tell Israelis, in effect, you're the world's worst criminals, and therefore you need to end the occupation. The result is exactly the opposite. When we find ourselves pushed into a corner, the average Israeli response is, aha, we recognize this moment. This is a moment we know from Jewish history. And so the Israeli response isn't to give in, but the opposite, to become more hardline. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I wrote this, I don't remember if I wrote this, but stigmatizing Israel, boycotting Israel, is a gift to the Israeli hard right. They thrive on this notion that the whole world hates us, the whole world always hated us, and here's your. The thing about BDS that is increasingly of concern to me is that I don't think in the end that BDS is really a strategic threat to Israel, certainly not to the Israeli economy. And we have the Eurovision that's just opened up. BDS isn't working on that level. But where BDS is working is in making diaspora Jews increasingly uncomfortable in certain places. So that BDS threatens to set back the clock of diaspora progress, going back to the days when diaspora Jews had to keep their heads down, wear a Magen David, a Jewish star around your neck, which we're seeing happening in Europe, and that's the process that's starting to come to some progressive spaces in America. And so the threat of BDS is to make American Jews insecure in their Jewishness. Great achievement that my generation, American Jews, experienced was we were the first generation to genuinely be fully accepted by American society, to be where all the Ivy League colleges opened up to us, where intermarriage became a acceptable for non-Jewish society. Right? And for all the reservations that you hear, and I understand that in the Jewish community, there's another story here, which is that America really opened up to the Jews. My wife comes from an old New England family, a Pilgrim family, actually a Mayflower family. She converted to Judaism and moved to Israel. But the wider story there is that her family fully accepted me. a boy from Brooklyn, who then took their daughter to Israel. So something happened in America that has never happened in Jewish history before. And it's an extraordinary victory of American Jewry. That victory is now under assault by BDS.
Okay, so that I'm going to follow up with something that we talked about just before we started the live feed. So you know this one's coming, but it's very consistent. There's a quote from the book that really shook me, where you wrote where you were talking about Herzl. And you wrote, most of the wealthy Jews of Western Europe shunned him, fearing that his plan for a Jewish state would undermine their own efforts to be accepted into Gentile society. As you were just saying, with your generation, you felt that Jews were accepted into Gentile society. But you wrote of Herzl that when he was shunned by influential Jews who wanted to be accepted into Gentile society, Herzl thought, good luck with that. So, his dream, of course, was the establishment or the reestablishment of a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel. And he believed that that needed to exist because Jews would never be accepted into Gentile society in the ways, at least at the level. Oh my God, no, we're here still. Are you still there? Yeah. Well, I don't know what just happened.
You froze. I didn't hear anything you just said for the last minute or so.
The last minute? Oh, you didn't hear the question?
Yeah, you were quoting something about Herzl from the book.
Okay, so in the book where you spoke about Herzl being shunned by the influential Jews of Western Europe, who feared that his plan for a Jewish state would undermine their efforts to be accepted into Gentile society, which is what you were just talking about, that your generation, you feel, was accepted into Gentile society and was sort of, comfortable, and Gentile society was comfortable with you. So Herzl, in response to this kind of perception by the influential Jews that he needed to get on board with his Zionist plans, thought, good luck with that. Essentially the Gentile society would never actually welcome Jews to the extent that we would need to be welcomed to know that we were safe in perpetuity. So my question, it really shook me because he was, he had such foresight. He knew that there was really no circumstance in which Jews would ever actually be welcomed into Gentile society, and that we would need our state to be safe. And when I talked about this with you just an hour or so ago, or just before we started, you brought up the very good point that Israel is also not very safe. So there's really nowhere that the Jews are safe, even though, of course, we have an army protecting us in Israel as Jews. So I guess I don't even know what the question is. Just maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of Herzl's dream and assimilation more broadly, the threat that assimilation poses to us as a people, and then how Israel plays into that.
I'll try to answer in two ways. One is in terms of Israel. There was an old Zionist dream, promise, conceit that a Jewish state would effectively end anti-Semitism. Well, as we would say in Brooklyn, that didn't work out so good. And my understanding today of the Zionist achievement is not to have changed the anti-Semites, but to have changed Jews, and to have empowered the Jews to defend ourselves. So that the creation of Israel has created a dynamic which has spilled over into the diaspora of Jewish assertiveness, of our ability to deal with anti-Semitism. Not that it cured anti-Semitism, but that it in a way cured the Jews and allowed us to morph it. In terms of American Jewry, sitting in Pittsburgh, the really interesting question, I referred to this earlier, is what does Pittsburgh prove about American Jewry? Does it prove that the old Zionist notion that there is no safe haven for Jews and an illusion is true for America as well? No. There was a massacre in a synagogue, and on the other hand, the aftermath of Pittsburgh, the horror of so many non-Jews, and the way, what I saw happening over and over again in the memorials that I attended, was non-Jews speaking about the assault on a synagogue in Pittsburgh as an assault on them. They weren't expressing solidarity with the Jews. They were saying this is something that happened to us as well. This is America. This is an assault on America. So it was a church or a mosque or a synagogue. And so the aftermath of Pittsburgh, in a way, proved that America is different. And I remember a terror attack that happened against a Reformed synagogue in Paris. This was in the 1980s. Rue Cabernet. The Reformed synagogue was bombed. It was a bomb placed outside. And 3 or 4 people were killed. They were all passersby, and they all happened to be non-Jews. The French Prime Minister at the time actually said innocent Frenchmen were killed in this terror attack. So, meaning that non-Jews. Now, who would say that in America? You know, it's so.
I think of some people.
Well, yeah, maybe, but you know, it's not the normative discourse,
right?
And so that, I think, is really an indication that America, despite everything, is still different. And I believe that. And so I think that what we have to be very careful of at this moment, where pathological anti-Semitism is reasserting, is not to allow anti-Semitism to totally dominate our Jewish conversation, our Jewish lives, our identities. There, we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it effectively. But that's not, it never was, and it certainly should not now. So, Jewishness.
And I think that's why Israeli society is so powerful for those of us who have been there. That when we're there and we see the way that Israelis live, constantly under threat, constantly under some kind of assault, whether it's a political assault or a physical assault. But last weekend there were rocket attacks, and this week was Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut, and now it's Eurovision, and Israelis are celebrating in the streets after, such a solemn week, and after the threats last weekend and the death of, I think, 5 now innocent Israelis. So it is, I think, a lesson for all of us in the diaspora, because we are very afraid. I think there's a lot of fear in our community and a lot of insecurity about how to handle it properly, because we don't feel like we're really well represented politically, and we don't feel like anyone really understands our story, or at least that's how I feel. Anti-Semitism is so complicated, and that's why I think your book is so important, because it explains anti-Semitism, and your book, you've been talking about how anti-Semitism manifests differently over time and how it manifests today. The Jew of the nations, I have been quoting you everywhere, obviously quoting you, saying, crediting you, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And kind of a related question there is about how, your book gives a lot of different arguments for Zionism, a lot of different ways for people to try to explain what it is to people who don't understand. And with Zioness, we are actively working to engage in coalition building on domestic policy agendas, on social justice issues, and the conflict is sort of always in the background as a challenge to the relationships that we're trying to build. People who don't understand it, or who are hearing things that that they don't know how to challenge, and so they're internalizing whether they're a fact or not, whether they're hearing them from Jews or not. And I think something I hear a lot from people that I'm close with is that they're uncomfortable with the Zionist claim, or the claim of the Jewish right to the land of Israel from a religious lens. People who are uncomfortable with the or the historical, that thousands of years ago we were there. And I personally am not religious, I'm not observant. But for me, Zionism is honestly the core component of my Jewish identity in 2019. And I think there are so many people like me who feel Israel as part of us. We think of friends and family in Israel when rockets are raining down on Israel, and that is what connects us to our Judaism. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, Zionism as the Jewish identity, or at least a very central part of it for most American Jews who are not, religiously active, and why the attacks on Zionism and the Israel being the Jew of the nations as the modern manifestation of anti-Semitism is so pernicious and dangerous.
Well, I wrote my book from a religious perspective. I would say it's a religious book in some ways. Mm-hmm. And I did that because I felt that I have a real conversation with a Palestinian neighbor who is most likely traditional, if not actively religious. A religious language needs to be part of peace. And one of the departures in my book from the conventional Western notions of peacemaking is the emphasis on the religion. I don't believe that you can have the Middle East without some religious legitimacy for the compromises that both sides. So it was an interesting decision that I had to make because, as you say, certainly a majority of young American Jews tend to be disengaged religiously. And I was hoping with this book to reach not only my Palestinian neighbors, but also have a conversation with young American Jews who I would hope would be eavesdropping on my neighbor. But I realized at a certain point that I'm going to have to make a choice which audience is my first priority. And I realized my first priority must be my Palestinian neighbor. So even if a religious sensibility would not speak to certain American Jews, I knew that it would speak to Palestinians, and that was more important. Yeah. And my hope was that American Jews would at least understand that, and even if they would share in that religious perspective, might appreciate the fact that that is how Israelis and Palestinians need to speak. And I received validation of that. Some of the letters that responded to that religious language, and one guy wrote me saying, I so much appreciate the fact that you bring God into the conversation. It allows me to hear your narrative. And so even if that doesn't work or works against me with some American Jews, I needed to write the book in the most authentic way.
That's fair.
So the other thing, Amanda, that I would say is that I have very little patience for the argument over Israel's existence. To argue whether Israel should exist or shouldn't exist was legitimate up until May 14th, 1948. The moment that Israel came into existence, argument over existence became, in my mind, illegitimate. And one of the, we did it. Whether we should have done it, whether it makes sense after 2,000 years, whatever it is, we actually did it. And we have produced now, one generation after another, of indigenous Israeli. And one of the things that really makes me crazy is that the more we become re-indigenized, the more time goes by, and one generation after another of Israeli Jews emerge, the more the international conversation is shifting toward delegitimizing Israel. And Israel exists because it exists. And I refuse to argue my right to exist. I am demeaned by that conversation. I met with a group, a few years ago, I met with a group of German journalists. One of them said, in Germany, we're all very pro-Israel. We believe Israel has the right to this. And my response was, I'm very pro-German. I believe Germany has the right to exist. And everybody kind of laughed nervously because they knew that suddenly when you phrase it that way, maybe it doesn't sound so good, especially coming from Germany. And so thank you very much. Thank you for supporting my right to exist. But that's not an issue for me. And I would say that, and this goes back to something of a centrist sensibility, I would say that I have two sources of anguish today, Israeli. The first source of anguish is that the Jewish people find itself in a long-term situation where we are occupying, controlling another people. And the second source of anguish is that 70 years after the Shoah, we're still justifying our existence. And I find both of those situations, each in their own way, intolerable. And that really, in some way, for me, sums up the dilemma of 2019. And I don't know the way out of either of those, but I think that to be faithful to the complexity of this moment requires very complicated sort of.
Yeah.
Maybe we should end on a better note, on a happier note.
We will. I have one more question, but there's a quick thing I just want to say. I was laughing when you made the comment about Germany because I've been talking a lot about this too. I've been talking about Spain though. I've been saying, we talk a lot about the pro-Israel community. And I hate the term pro-Israel so much because it sets up these binaries where if it's okay to be part of the pro-Israel community, it's okay to be part of the anti-Israel community. And there's no other state in the world that has an anti-community. There's no anti-Spain movement. There's no anti-Russia movement or anti-China movement. There's no country in the world that doesn't have human rights issues, many of which are much worse than, even the worst of Israel's behavior. So I totally agree with you. The other paradigm that I talk about, that the binary that exists with the pro-Israel language, is that if one is pro-Israel, they are anti-Palestinian. And it's so not true. And it's been, I think the inverse is actually true, where I think in large part the movement that considers itself pro-Palestinian, many people who consider themselves part of that movement don't realize that they're not actually doing anything to advance Palestinian lives or Palestinian society or infrastructure or schools or hospitals or, any of the things that would make the lives of Palestinians better and more positive, which is what we, the Jews, which you write so much about in your book, which we want. And that's why
my colleague, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, head of Hartman Institute, calls himself pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. That's very appealing.
Yeah, I think we all really, maybe Zioness will adopt some language like that, because I think it's so important that we break down that binary and emphasize the fact that most Jews want Palestinian self-determination, in fact, want it desperately. And it's unfortunate. I mean, BDS, I always talk about how BDS movement is only pro-Palestinian to the extent that it is anti-Israel. And, it claims to be this pro-Palestinian movement, but it's not. It doesn't even talk about the Palestinians. And I am like you. I desperately want them to have their own state. And I think most American Jews and most Israeli Jews feel the same way. So that in itself is slightly more positive. But I guess in terms of the last question, people have been writing on the Facebook asking about the person that, you've become friends with, who started responding to your book. And I know some people read the New York Times publication of one letter that was very negative in response to your book, but I know you've received hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many responses, but a lot of responses. I know some of them are coming out in your book in June. So maybe just talk a little bit about the new book and beyond the one that you already mentioned, what the letters kind of say, and ultimately, do you have hope? Because a lot of people are losing hope.
So the letters, all of them, all the letters that I chose, express pain, anger, deeply challenge lots of facets of the narrative that I laid down in the book, but at the same time are ready to engage in the conversation that I went through a moment ago. Basically, right versus wrong. Two indigenous peoples fighting over a tormented, and the need to accommodate both people. So, in that sense, I don't make any claim for these letters being representative of anyone other than the people who wrote them. In the same way that I don't claim to represent anyone but myself. I'm a writer. So I wrote this book to have my own understanding of history, of the Israeli narrative, how I see the conflict resolving, and without any need to answer to anyone. And those are the letters that I got in response. Now, many of the letter writers wrote to me asking not to use their names publicly, no identifying traits. And I think that that also says something about the discourse in Palestinian society today. So Israeli society is going in an unhealthy direction. Palestinian society is going in. And if you're asking me, do I have hope? I would have to answer, I have no hope in the short term. I think the short term is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But I do think that the presence of an expansionist Iran is galvanizing parts of the world, creating opportunities for an Israeli presence in the Middle East that wasn't there before. And what that really means is that the opportunity for spillover on the Palestinian front will come not from necessarily hopes for peace as much as a shared sense of threat against Iran. My hope is that the strategic relationship that Israel is developing parts of the Sunni world will eventually become a political relationship, then help bring in the region to try to resolve the Palestinian. So do I think that's going to happen? I don't know. It's a long shot. But if you're asking me if I have hope, I remember Anwar Sadat getting off the plane at Ben Gurion Airport, being greeted by the most right-wing Israeli prime minister ever elected until that moment, which was Menachem Begin. Sadat, 4 years earlier, had launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur and was the most hated man in Israel. And so Sadat and Begin, we take for granted now in peace. But at that time, it was surrealistic. Now, I understand the Palestinian issue is different in all kinds of ways. Nevertheless, I think that in the Middle East, in Israeli reality, nothing can ever be ruled out. Now, that's bad news, but it's also really good news.
Yeah.
And so the last thing that I'll say in terms of hope is that I have hope as a religious person. My universe is not random. It's not controlled by human beings. Ultimately, I certainly believe in free will up to a point, but I also believe that there is a divine plan. I believe that we live within, shall we call it, the mind of God. We're all parts of this unfathomable mind. And I don't know how any of that plays out for us. I don't know if the fact that, I believe that God exists. I don't know if that's, I'll put it another way, that's not a guarantee of anything. And so that's where I part company with the more deterministic believers. But I do believe that whatever happens is planned. And so in that sense, Hope is, in some sense, not quite the point. The point is to really try to align oneself individually and collectively with the divine will for humanity. And so I guess the hope would be that we're capable of doing that. And I do believe that that's possible. And maybe the last point is related to
keep
this,
going all night, everybody will say.
That we are living at an extraordinarily terrifying moment, but also a moment with extraordinary potential. I mean, this is the first time in human history where we can no longer be certain of human coming, either because of the nuclear threat or environmental issues. And we are looking at the possibility of an end to the human story. And at the same time, we also live in a moment where we can conceive of an end to hunger and illness. It's an unbelievable moment, and you can really feel this certain race happening between the forces of extinction. So when I think of hope, we're living in a very stark moment, certainly for Israel, the Jewish people, but in some sense we're a metaphor of the human reality. And that's where, for me, faith comes in, because when I don't believe that we're on, I think that
you're breaking up. The mic is under your chin, I think.
I don't believe that humanity is on its own. I think that we are in a partnership with this tremendous divine force being. And I have hope that we will gradually shift away from the extinctionist direction toward the transcendent direction. And I believe that that's why the Jewish people exist. That has been our role in history, catalysts for transcendence. And I think that to some extent we have played that role well. And this, for me, this is one of those moments where we really need to start figuring who we are as people and what we're all about, because humanity really needs wisdom of Jewish survival. We are the great survivors of human history, and we need to start figuring out what is the wisdom of Jewish survival and how do we apply that to humanity. That's the book I'm working on. So
there are more books.
Maybe we'll
do this again, I hope.
I hope so. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. There's just one point I want to make to that, and it's from Letters, and it's about the chosen people, about the language, the phrase, the chosen people. And I didn't know, I actually never really knew anything about where the term came from, but it was so meaningful to me to read in the book that actually we're chosen for this obligation, this responsibility. It's not, we're not chosen as superior or, as somehow more gifted or more special. It's an obligation that we have for Tikkun Olam, and to bring good and light into the world. And I feel that obligation. I know you do too, and I know that everyone in Zioness is committed to those values. And I thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I think it's really important that we as a people recognize that our responsibility to make the world a better place. Thank you. And you're doing that.
Amanda. Thank you. So are you. Thanks very much.
Yossi, you're the best. Thank you.
With you.
Enjoy your book tour, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.
Take care, Amanda.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Take care.